Good evening. We are in Nehemiah chapter 13 tonight. We had talked a little bit last week at the end of class about the first paragraph or so, the 9 verses, the first 2 paragraphs really, where the children of Judah are separating themselves from foreigners, expelling foreigners from the land who don't really belong there, don't have any business there. And from verses 4 through 9, the focus is on Eliashib or Eliashib, the priest, seems to be the high priest at this point, who has become allied, the King James American Standard Version says, or related, the English Standard, to Tobiah. And you recall Tobiah is basically the governor of the Ammonites. He is an idolater. He is a neighbor. He is one of those who had first, with Sanballat, attempted to have a part in the construction of Jerusalem, and then opposed it and threatened war and violence and so forth against the Jews in the building of the wall, and had been excluded by Nehemiah. Whether there's any Persian political machinations or Persian agenda behind Nehemiah's actions, that's open to some debate, but certainly it's a possibility. But in the time between Nehemiah's return to Shushan to report, basically, and then his coming back for a second term or extension of his term as governor, Tobiah has moved in. How did this come about? No idea. It's simply reported as an accomplished fact. It's given the magnitude of the reforms that have been taking place under Nehemiah's leadership, given the span of time. Nehemiah's been in Jerusalem and in Judah for 12 years, from the 20th year of the king Artaxerxes down to the 32nd year. So he's been there a long time. You would think by this point that would not be possible. But one way or another, the high priest has been corrupted in spite of Nehemiah's influence and leadership. And Tobiah not only has become connected, evidently through his daughter, to the high priest, but he has been received into Jerusalem and afforded an apartment in the temple. Now, the description of his facilities here in chapter 13, the American Standard says that in verse 5, they had prepared for him a great chamber where aforetime they laid meal offerings, frankincense, vessels, tithes of grain, new wine, oil, which were given by commandment to the Levites and singers and porters, and the heave offerings for the priests. This would seem to be not merely a storeroom, but evidently an area where an area that perhaps they used as a refectory, a place where they would gather and eat and share time and so forth. And he has no business as a non-Jew being in this part of the temple at all. Being in the temple, really, but certainly not in this part of the temple. He would have been eligible, in a manner of speaking, to come into what we would recognize as the court of the Gentiles, here this far and no farther. And he's way on in. Nehemiah explains, well, I was out of town. I was out of the country. How long was Nehemiah gone? Don't know. A minimum estimation would be the better part of a year. A more likely, just because of travel time and because of obligations in the court and all the goings on of the court, possibly as much as 18 months or a couple of years. Most scholars that I have read, most of the references that I have, put his second term as beginning somewhere between 18 months and 2 years after the first term. So from 445 to about 433, and then from about 431 to we don't know how long would be the time that Nehemiah reigns or rules, really, as governor of Judah in Jerusalem. He discovers this mess when he comes back. And there is there is a house cleaning. And that's a polite way to put it. Notice, if you will, in verses 7 and 8, I came to Jerusalem and I discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah, preparing him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. Now, the way this is worded is very specific. And the focus here is not really Tobiah. What's he doing here? The focus seems to be, Mr. High Priest, Eliashib, what have you done? How did this, how could you allow this to happen? The anger is not so much directed at Tobiah as it is at the priest, who should have known better, who unquestionably did know better, but did it anyway. And there's a point to be made in that circumstance. James writes in James chapter 4, to him who knows to do good, knows the right thing to do, and does not do it, to him it is sin. The Hebrews writer in Hebrews chapter 10 makes the point that if we sin willfully, there remains no more a sacrifice for sin. There is no excuse. There's no excuse for informed sin. There is a distinction in the scriptures between those sins that are committed in ignorance and those sins that are committed in full knowledge that this is wrong and I should not do this, or I ought to do this and I'm refusing to do this. There is a distinction, a recognition of the difference between those in the scriptures. Now, the guilt or the sinfulness of them, there's no distinction in that respect. Ignorance is no excuse of the law, as the saying goes. But here we're looking at a man whose responsibility, whose relationship, A, with God, and B, with his people, ought to have him beyond even momentary consideration of something like this. Now, for Tobiah to be related to him, what does that imply about Eliashib's marriage? He seems to be Tobiah's son-in-law. He's not supposed to marry a foreign woman. He's not even supposed to marry a woman of another tribe. He's supposed to marry a Levite, a virgin, no widows, no divorcees. He has a very narrow range of marital possibilities in the first place as high priest. He should be utterly disqualified from the priesthood for this marriage. And seemingly he was allowed to go on at least until Nehemiah returned seemingly without opposition. If he had opposition, he was able to overbear it. His actions in this set the stage, whether knowingly or not. They set the stage for the attitude and the actions of the priests in centuries to come during the intertestamental period. Because even though Artaxerxes appoints Nehemiah as governor on behalf of the Persian government, even though there would undoubtedly be succeeding governors after him representing the Persian authorities, there will be no king ruling in Jerusalem. There will be members of the royal family. In one sense, every Jew, every one of the tribe, the house of Judah, is a member of the royal family in roundabout way. They're all kinfolks. But there will be no king, no civil figurehead until Herod comes along, and Herod's not even Jewish by heritage. Judah is a theocracy. Civil law, religious obligation, one and the same. A crime against the state is a sin against God. A sin against God is a crime against the state. They're intermingled and in some respects indistinguishable. But God, through Moses, had very specifically separated and defined the responsibilities and the authority of the king, the royal lineage on one hand, and the priesthood on the other. And here, with Eliashib, I don't know if we're seeing the beginnings of what will take place after Alexander, after the Greeks, in the days of the leading up to the days of the Romans. I don't know if that has its roots in this man or not. But moving forward, we're going to see, especially in the days of the Maccabees and afterwards, we're going to see the priests who are supposed to rule in spiritual matters taking over rulership of political matters, to the point that in the lifetime of Jesus, one of the primary reasons that the scribes and the chief priests and the Pharisees are so determined to eliminate him is because they see him as a threat to their political influence over the people. And they weren't supposed to have political influence at all. That was the king's responsibility. But they are going to accumulate to themselves that political power. In fact, in the century leading up to the time of Jesus, during the era of the Maccabees, we're going to find in the 2nd century BC, in the aftermath of the successful Maccabean revolt, there would be proposals that the Maccabees, who are the de facto rulers, just go ahead and become kings. And the immediate family rejects that. They acknowledge, no, we're Levites, we're priests, we're not authorized to be kings. We've become the de facto rulers by virtue of the war. But go about 3 generations down the road toward Jesus, and what do we find? We find the effort to join the high priestly mitre and the king's crown being basically accepted by the priests, even though not officially by the people. Well, to say that Nehemiah was mad is an understatement. I was very angry, threw out the household furniture, gave orders, and they cleansed the chamber. They had to fumigate it. It was defiled by his presence. I brought back the vessels of the house of God, things that belonged there that had been removed for an idolater to move in. In one sense, what Nehemiah ends up doing here is reminiscent of what the people had had to do in the days of Josiah, for example, and in the days of Hezekiah, in cleansing the temple, in removing things. You think about what was involved in Josiah's day, for example. Now, who's Josiah's father? Manasseh. So what took place in Jerusalem and even in the temple grounds during the rulership of Manasseh, 50 some odd years of Manasseh's reign? Idolatry on every hand, even in the temple grounds, child sacrifice right there in Jerusalem, every variety of impurity and uncleanness that you can imagine associated with idolatry. So we come down to the days of Josiah, Hilkiah, the high priest. Look what we have found, the book of the law. It's been squirreled away, hidden away, covered with debris, who knows what. It may well have been like the Bibles in so many people's homes, just closed up, set on a shelf and gathering dust. Josiah, as it is read to him, realizes we're in a heap of trouble and we've got to set things right. So what Nehemiah is doing here, in one sense, is very much akin to what Hezekiah and Josiah had done before him. But pick up at verse 10. I also found out that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who did the work each fled to his field. Well, you back up into this previous paragraph. Where was Tobiah living? He's living in the storeroom or the refectory area, that refectory, yeah, the common area that was for this purpose for the Levites and the singers. However it's happened, their common area has been colonized by a heathen. The place where all of their support and sustenance would normally have been gathered and stored has been taken over. Well, where's all that going to go? It's not going to them. Whether it's his influence or the high priest's, or his influence on the high priest, the priests serving are being neglected. Now, if you have a choice between starvation and going home and making a basic living, what are most folks going to do? Well, that's what happened to the priests here. Now, the corollary to that is, if the priests have to go home just to survive, what happens to worship in the house of God? It's not being carried out as it ought to. Now, is Eliashib, the high priest, still there? Seemingly so. I mean, he's the guy in control. But who's serving? Who's taking care of the routine affairs? Morning and evening sacrifice, the burning of incense, the changing of the showbread, and the fueling of the lampstand, and just all the routine things that are part of daily temple service. Oh no. Given that having Tobiah in the temple defiled it, may well be that those things came to a screeching halt. Tobiah's presence there would seem to speak to political ambitions or political agenda on the part of both Tobiah and Eliashib. So concern about spiritual things is evidently not high up on the list of things to attend to. The portions of the Levites had not been given to them. They fled, went to the field. I confronted the officials. Why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together and set them in their stations. Not giving, not carrying out the obligations of the law. Even if the people were continuing to give, it was not making its way to the people it was destined for. And notice how Nehemiah describes this. Why is this forsaken? Why is the house of God deserted? Now, there's a point that we might draw out here, and there is distinction between the Hebrew of Nehemiah and the Greek of the book of Hebrews. But there is a commonality of thought in these descriptions. You look at what Nehemiah says about this situation. The house of God has been forsaken. Well, are there still Jews in Jerusalem? Absolutely. Is the high priest still there? Seemingly so. What has changed? The things these people are supposed to be doing aren't being done. Flip over to Hebrews 10 and verse 25, and you read about the assembling of the saints together. And what's the injunction there? Do not forsake the assembling of yourselves together, as the manner of some is, but consider one another so much the more as you see the day approaching. How many times have we heard that missing a Bible class, missing a worship service, missing a Wednesday night service, missing a gospel meeting, missing vacation Bible school, that's forsaking the assembly? Attending and participating with the children of God in worship is a matter of paramount importance in the life of the healthy spiritual life of a Christian. Participating in the Bible classes, attending things like gospel meetings, vacation Bible school, things of that sort, is a tremendous asset. And it is expected by the Lord. Be subject to those who have the rule over you, the Hebrews writer says. Submit to the elders. They have the responsibility to see to our spiritual health and well-being, and the authority to set the activities that we need to participate in. Hebrews 10 verse 25 is not speaking to missing a Sunday evening service because you had to travel, or because your employer called you into work, or because you're a cop and you work shift work, or missing one night of gospel meeting because you were sick, or you got stuck in a traffic jam trying to get home from work, or something like that. In both of these circumstances, in Nehemiah chapter 13 and Hebrews chapter 10, even though the particulars are dramatically different, the thought expressed is fundamentally the same. Why is the house of God deserted? Why have you deserted the house of God? Why have you deserted your responsibilities? Why are the things that should be going on not taking place? Well, Hebrews chapter 10, do not desert the assembling of the saints. Do not absent yourself chronically because you have a responsibility to fulfill, just like these folks do. So I gathered everything together and set it in order. Now you get down here, all Judah brought the tithe of grain, wine, oil. I appointed as treasurer Shelemiah and Zadok the scribe, Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, Pedaiah of the Levites, as their assistant, Hanan the son of Zachar, son of Mattaniah, for they were considered reliable, and their duty was to distribute to their brothers. So faithful men are given responsibility over this. You flip over to Acts chapter 6 and the disagreement amongst the early Christians about the taking care of the widows. And the apostles give instructions, and what's the primary instruction? You look out amongst yourselves faithful men, dependable men, reliable men that we can set over this. There is an element of the definition of faithfulness in both of these circumstances, here in Nehemiah 13 and there in Acts chapter 6, that we sometimes overlook. Is brother XYZ faithful? Why, yes, he's here every time the door's open. Can you depend on him to carry out a task or a responsibility if he's asked to? Well, now, you know, he's a working man. He's don't depend on him Monday through Friday or Saturday. You know, Saturday's got kids' sports and so forth, but he'll be here Sunday morning. He'll be here every Sunday. Faithful applies to more than attendance. Faithful applies to more than holding the right positions on brotherhood issues. Faithful speaks to action as well. And these men are dependable. You can rely on them to carry out their responsibilities. So then, at verse 14, Nehemiah expresses himself in prayer. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I've done for the house of my God and for his service. What did it cost Nehemiah to be governor of Judah and Jerusalem? Or did it?
Well, he freely gave up the right to tax his
Okay.
fellow Jews.
Well, he gave up what could have been a lucrative authority, taxing his fellow Jews. And he would have had the might and the authorization of the Persian government behind him to do that, but he didn't exercise that right. What else did it cost him?
A life of, I hate to say ease, but a easier life.
Okay, and an easier
within the king's
life.
palace than he was
What's
seeing now.
what was the likely greatest danger that he would have faced in Shushan had he just continued as cupbearer to the king?
Consuming poison.
Well, either somebody managing to poison the wine, so to speak, or maybe somebody managing to elbow him out of a job and take his position. But being in the palace, that would have been on a par with being the senior executive assistant to the president or something of that sort. And he willingly lets that go to become the governor of what's arguably the most troubled and troublesome new province in all of the Persian hegemony. And as you read through Nehemiah, what do you find him doing during these 12 years that he's getting the wall built and getting the city put back together and getting things in order and straightening out the priesthood and so forth before he ever goes back to Shushan? Basically, the guy is doing nothing but putting out brush fire after brush fire after brush fire, dealing with problem after problem after problem. And that's a pretty stressful way to spend your time. And then goes back and reports, here's what all we've accomplished. And comes back and finds his own people actively involved in undoing many of the things that he'd accomplished, many of the things that he'd done. And I say all that to say this: I think you look at verse 14 and what you see basically is if there is such a thing, it's the prayer of extreme exasperation, the prayer of just extraordinary frustration. Lord, how could it go back this way? Don't forget, I tried to straighten this out, Lord. And it does make the point as we come to the end of the chapter. Where do we start in Nehemiah? Basically, we start with Nehemiah praying, and we're going to pretty well end with Nehemiah praying as well. He's consistent in that respect. So the next paragraph from 15 to 22 deals with the practices of the people. And it would seem that this is something that has come in again during his absence. How long do you have to be without oversight before you start doing things on your own? Well, it depends a little bit on the people, doesn't it? But there may be, and I say may because I don't know, there may be something of the influence of Tobiah here during this period. I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath, bringing in heaps of grain, loading them on donkeys, and wine and grapes, and figs, and all kinds of loads that they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them on the day when they sold food. Their own labor condemns them. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. 6 days you work, the seventh day you rest. That's one of the fundamental aspects of the law of Moses. And yet these people whose very existence is supposed to be built around that identity as people of the book, people of the law, are ignoring it. If memory serves me, it was the 6-Day War in 1967. I don't believe that was 72. I think that was 67, where the coalition of Arabic governments, Egyptians and Syrians and others, launched all-out war against modern-day Israel, which is, as we talked about, is not the Israel of the Bible, but presents itself as if it is. And they launched that conflict on a Saturday, on a Sabbath, necessitating that the Israeli army and air force and such naval forces as they might have had to A, defend themselves, and B, begin to strike back on the Sabbath day. We have the statement in the law, remember the Sabbath, don't work on the Sabbath. This is a day set aside holy unto the Lord. But that injunction does not prohibit all activity on the Sabbath day for the Jew. Jesus and his disciples passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath day. The disciples plucked ears of grain and winnowed them out between their hands to have something to munch on. And what did the chief priests and scribes accuse? They're working on the Sabbath. They're harvesting on the Sabbath day. And Jesus pointed out, you're being inconsistent in this. What they're doing is not a violation of the law, but you would justify David eating showbread, which was actually a violation of the law. Likewise, Jesus heals how many different people in different synagogues on the Sabbath day? And they accuse him of working on the Sabbath day. And he asks, is it wrong to do good or to kill on the Sabbath day? Consider the conundrum that he paints for them. Your neighbor falls in the ditch and you basically say, well, I'm sorry, here you are down the well with a broken leg. You're going to have to stay there till it's not the Sabbath anymore. But if your ox falls in the ditch, oh, come on, we got to get him out of there. He's a financial investment. We can't afford to lose that. The issue here in Nehemiah's day is not that they were doing any of the minor things that would be permitted on the Sabbath day. And the issue here is not that it was an emergency situation like the ox in the ditch. They were ignoring the Sabbath day. They were treating the Sabbath day like it was just another work day. Notice in verse 16, he mentions here that foreigners, Tyrians, were bringing fish and goods to market on the Sabbath day. Now, the people of Tyre were not under the law of Moses until they came into the territory of Judah. And in the territory of Judah, or previously in all the territory of Israel, strangers were obligated to the law of Moses just like Israelites were. Now, they didn't have all the same obligations. They couldn't go into the temple and offer sacrifice. They weren't supposed to. They'd have to hire a Jew to go offer a sacrifice for them because they couldn't enter in. But as far as the observance of the laws, you have one law for the homeborn and the foreigner alike. Here you've got not only Jewish people, but even foreigners turning Jerusalem into a marketplace on the Sabbath day. And so Nehemiah's response to this is to face down the leadership. These things could not have happened with righteous leadership at the top. I wonder what it says about Nehemiah, or if it says anything about Nehemiah, that his departure to go back to Shushan and report seemingly left such a void of godly leadership that all of this could develop in a matter of months or a couple of years. If nothing else, there is a practical lesson to draw out here that changes in leadership, even seemingly minor changes or temporary changes, can have profound, far-reaching effects. Think of how dramatically things change in a congregation when one of two elders in a congregation dies or becomes a widower and can no longer serve as an elder. And the affairs, the day-to-day operation of the congregation devolves back to a men's business meeting because there are no other men to serve. Or how the change in an eldership from 3 men to 4 men, or one man dies or steps back and another man takes his place, how that can change dramatically the complexion of an eldership within a congregation. I don't want to say that Nehemiah had neglected to install competent, faithful, spiritually minded men in positions of responsibility. He may have done all of that, and it was just that the high priest had more clout than they could cope with. But when you think about it, it does sort of make you wonder, how could things go so whacked out awry so seemingly so quickly after he left? How could, after 12 years of reform and correction and steady hand, it seems, how could it go south so quick?
Do we have any indication how long in that 12-year period before, for example, they hadn't been keeping the year Jubilee or the year of, how long that went on in the 12 years?
Okay, there's a good question there, good thought. How we know that they came back under Zerubbabel 2.5 generations before, in the days of Haggai and Zechariah, very, very, very focused on proper restoration. Go back to the book, make it everything that it should have been before and wasn't. And it seemed to just peter out with that generation, because even while Haggai is still there, just 15 years after Zerubbabel, he's saying, you're not prospering, you're putting your money in a bag of holes, Haggai 1 and verse 6, because you're not focused on the right things. You're not faithful to the Lord first. You're busy trying to store up for the winter and provide for yourself and make your home more comfortable and so forth. You're not focused on the right things. Focus on spiritual priorities, and God will take care of the physical things. And if he doesn't, you're preparing for eternity anyway, not for just life in this world. After all, Lazarus was a beggar, but he was a faithful beggar. But in the case of Nehemiah, when Nehemiah arrives, he's got a battle on his hands, both materially and politically and economically and so forth, but also spiritually. We don't have any record in the scriptures of the Sabbath year, of the Jubilee year. We know that the priests and the Levites would have kept records. They were great record keepers. They would have known when it was supposed to be. All along, they'd have known when it's supposed to be the Sabbath year, when it's supposed to be the Jubilee year, and so forth. And from that standpoint, they could easily have just picked up in the calendar under Nehemiah's leadership. Now, did they? I don't know. Did they do that in Zerubbabel's day?
It seemed like every time they were reading the law, it was something brand new to them. They never heard it. They weren't doing it.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, when you don't, Paul wrote to Christians and said, it's not necessary for me to tell you these things. I'm telling you stuff you already know, but it's safe. We were talking about algebra before class began. I can count on one hand with fingers left over probably the number of times that I've actually had to apply algebra in my adult life. Now, trig is accepted because that's useful. Algebra is something designed by mischievous math teachers to torture innocent students. I can still do algebra problems, but I have to really think about it. And I have to read them again and again and again and again before I begin to remember what to do with everything and what these words mean and so forth. Sometimes I have to go get a dictionary and look them up. If I did it every day, I wouldn't have to think about it. I can read, write, and speak English, German, and Spanish. And I don't have to think about English because I speak English and I'm exposed to English every day. I have to be in Mexico. I have to be immersed in Spanish language 2 or 3 days minimum before I can begin to think in Spanish instead of constantly translating back and forth. In German, the same way. You don't use it, you really do begin to lose it, or at least lose the use of it. And that seems to be what happens to these people over and over and over with the Word of God. Now, the average Jew did not have a complete copy of the Old Testament in their possession. They would go to the synagogue to be able to read. The men would go to be able to read and to discuss and to study the scriptures. Come over to Acts chapter 8, the Ethiopian, who is a wealthy man. He's the treasurer of all of Ethiopia, possibly a proselyte Jew, maybe even a native-born Jew, but he's a eunuch. He has come all the way 1,000 miles from Ethiopia to worship in the temple, and at that point he can only come so far because he's a eunuch. But while he's there, what's he done? He's purchased a scroll, a book of Isaiah. He didn't purchase the whole Old Testament. That would have been a tremendous expense. But he purchased one book. Well, perhaps might have brought it with him. But he's got this book. That would set him apart from most Jews just in its own right. He actually has a copy of some of the scriptures. On one level, there might be some little degree of excuse for the common people to be somewhat ignorant. They couldn't just pick up their Bible and read. But with the leadership, the nobles, the priests, the Levites, no excuse, because that's their responsibility. The nobles, that's their responsibility. because of their position as leaders, as rulers. The Levites and the priests, that's their responsibility because that's who they are. That defines them. And yet, like you said, it seems like every generation, it's all brand new to them and they have to start from scratch. Sometimes even within the same generations. You don't use it, you're going to lose it. So you look at 17 and 18. I confronted the nobles of Judah, said to them, what is this evil thing that you're doing, profaning the Sabbath? How dare you? Did not your fathers act in this way and our God bring all this disaster on us? And you're bringing more wrath by profaning the Sabbath? Do you not know your history? You're doing the very same thing that sent us into captivity. So is there sarcasm here? I think it's safe to say there probably is. How dare you? Have you? The question is almost, have you lost your mind, your collective minds? In verse 19, he's got the next paragraph. Nehemiah uses his own personal bodyguard, it seems, to ensure that there are no more violations. Commanded that the doors should be shut, gave orders that they not be opened until after the Sabbath, stationed my servants at the gates. I'm going to make sure that this doesn't happen. So in verses 20 and 21, you see a strong desire the other way. Look at verse 20. It says here, the merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. Well, we're going to test the waters and see if we can't just continue. And you know, there's an application to think about here. Whether it's a matter of precedent, setting a bad precedent, or a matter of simple persistence on the part of people, when we allow an unrighteous act, an unrighteous practice to continue, we set a precedent for it to continue. We are encouraging it. Nehemiah took steps to prevent that. They tried. Once or twice. How long does it take to form a habit, good or bad?
Various numbers, but 21 days, 23 days.
Yeah. Generally, it doesn't take too awfully long. 3 or 4 weeks. Some would say 6 weeks. Do it every day for 6 weeks. You'll do it the rest of your life. Well, if I could make myself get out and jog every day for 6 weeks, I'd probably run myself to death. But you're not likely to see this fat boy running unless it's an emergency. But that cuts both ways. No drunkard ever started out as a drunkard. How'd they start? One drink. We let things go sometimes because we rationalize, well, they'll be too embarrassed, too ashamed, too uncomfortable to do it again. And then they do it again. And again. And after the 3rd or 4th or 5th time, they've already set a precedent that makes it difficult for us to step up and say, brother or sister, this ought not to be. You ought not to do this, go here, dress that way, use these words, whatever, because I've talked that way all my life. I don't see anything wrong with it. Nobody ever said anything about it before. You're the only one to complain about it. Nehemiah took steps to stop it and enforced it. And I have no doubt that the merchants from Tyre probably caterwauled clear to the top of the wall, with more than a few of the Jews right behind them, complaining bitterly about the hit that they were taking to their pocketbooks. And we don't see Nehemiah back down. It takes the threat of force. Verse 21, Nehemiah, I warned them, said to them, why do you lodge outside the wall? If you do it again, I'll lay hands on you. If you keep trying to push your way in, which is really what it amounts to, if you keep this up, I'll sick my troops on you. I'll sick the law on you. I know of a congregation some years ago where a sister in the congregation became very disenchanted with her life altogether, disenchanted with her husband, with the church, with pretty much everything, and became, in the congregation where she grew up, the focal point of a lot of dissension and unrest, to the point that after she divorced her husband, not for scriptural cause, the elders ultimately withdrew from her because she would not be reasoned with at all. She was combative and argumentative and quite frankly, crude with them in their efforts. But she persisted after that for a little while in attempting to attend activities and assemblies that suited her, because she wanted to maintain influence among some of the younger couples in the congregation. She was trying to influence them away. And it finally came down to the point that after consultation, one of the elders had to tell her, if you turn up here again, except to repent and to make this right, we will have you legally escorted off the property by the sheriff's deputy. And that put an end to the problem. Raging and cursing as she went, she did not go back. Nehemiah took strong action because it was necessary. So now we come down to the issue of mixed marriages once more. And we really have a problem here because you've got the high priest that has set the course in this, set the standard in this. Verses 24 to 29, the children of these relationships naturally speak the language of their mothers more than the language of their fathers because they're with them more. Now think about the dynamics of the typical home life in that ancient time. There were no two-income families in those days, not in the sense that we think of them anyway. Now you look at Proverbs 31, it's plain that the worthy woman is a hard-working woman and even a businesswoman, but not in a way that takes her outside the sphere of her home in the same way that her husband is outside. So child rearing is, in this circumstance, absolutely in the hands of the wives to a great degree. Children would spend more time with their mothers, initially at any rate. It's only natural then that they would tend to speak the mother's language more than the father's. So here we have Jews who've married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. And their children, their offspring, don't speak Hebrew. They speak some, but they're corrupted in that respect. Notice the response here. I confronted them. I cursed them. I beat some of them and pulled out their hair. Some translations say their beard. The curse here is not, obviously not profanity, not vulgarity, but rather a statement of that you are under condemnation because of this relationship. You are estranged from God because you have violated his instructions. There's no reference to divorce here. I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, you shall not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons or yourselves. Did they divorce the foreign wives? It doesn't say so. Did they allow the influence of the foreign wives to continue as it had been? I think that's a safe assumption they did not. Now, go back to Ezra chapter 10 for a minute. And just notice in Ezra 10, where we have confronted this situation, in verses 18 and following, some of the sons of the priests who'd married foreign women, and some of the Levites, and some of Israel, and sons of Bebai, and so forth. You got a whole census of them here. All these had married foreign women, and some of the women had even borne them children. They were required to put away their wives. There's no mention of that here, but it, I believe, would be a safe assumption that these also would have had to, or you wind up with a double standard between Ezra and Nehemiah. And remember, Ezra and Nehemiah are basically contemporaries. There are those among the commentators who contend that Ezra 10 and Nehemiah 13 are the same circumstance, the same situation. And may well be. Don't know that for certain, though. Certainly, if they put away their wives in Ezra 10 and they did not in Nehemiah 13, you've got a problem here. So, even though it's not specified here, that seems to be the reasonable understanding of this. I made them take an oath. You don't do this. And then notice in verse 27, if Solomon, with all of his wisdom, all of his knowledge and understanding, did not avoid sin in this kind of situation, what makes you think you can? Solomon is, who is Solomon? Solomon is the wisest ordinary mortal in all of history. Second only to Jesus himself. And God endowed him with extraordinary understanding and wisdom. And somewhere along the way, he wasted a lot of it, didn't he? Because he fell into sin because of his foreign wives. Among the many nations, there was no king like him. He was beloved by his God. God made him king over all Israel. But foreign women made even him to sin. Pagan women, foreign, outlandish. That's that Hebrew word We think of pagan as what? Idol worshipers. And certainly that's involved, that's in the picture here. The actual word means outlandish or beyond the pale. They're people who believe and do things that are not normal, out of the ordinary, unusual, out of place. Well, all of those terms describe things associated with idolatry. What else is commonly associated with idolatry, both in Old and New Testaments? Immorality. Now, there's a level of immorality in these relationships just by virtue of their existence. But the fact then that these wives are idolatrous women, does that introduce a whole nother element into this? I don't know. It would not be out of character for their particular religions, though, if that were a contributing factor in this situation as well. Nehemiah's summary of this at verse 27, shall we then listen to you? That seems to imply that Eliashib and some of them may have been trying to argue with him. Shall we listen to you and do this great evil and act treacherously against our God by marrying foreign women? He might as well have said, shall we just put a pistol to our heads and pull the trigger? Isn't it fascinating how often someone will rationalize 27 ways to Sunday why it's a good thing to commit spiritual suicide when they would never, ever, ever consider literally committing physical suicide? And yet that's what sin is. Choosing sin is spiritual suicide. So we get to verse 28. Now we're going to purge out this problem from among the priests. One of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, is son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. So it's as if it's not bad enough that Eliashib is allied with Tobiah. He's got a son married to the daughter of Sanballat. Therefore, I chased him from me. Brother Roy Deaver, many years ago, preached a sermon in a lecture series on this particular passage. And I can hear him just as vividly today as the day that I actually heard him reading this. I chased him from me. And the idea being, I ran him out. The point being, sometimes that's the only thing you can do in the face of sin, is to expel it, to run it out for the safety and the preservation of everyone else involved. The enemy is purged from the priesthood here, and you get down to verse 30, I cleanse them from everything foreign, establish the duties. You look at Nehemiah here, and you can't help but wonder, he must have been thinking to himself, I have to do this all over again? Because he's already done this once, hasn't he? Establish the duties of the priests and the Levites, each in his work, provided for the wood offering at appointed times for the first fruits. Remember me, oh my God, for good. It's almost as if to say, dear Lord, I had to do it again. Don't forget, I've done it and done it and done it and done it. There's a good thought in that last statement that maybe we don't consider. I have come to the point in life that when I read the paper every morning, one thing I look at are the obituaries. Because every so often I find a familiar name, somebody I've known in years gone by. Haven't seen it. I found the obituary for a sister that we knew 40 years ago in Austin, not long ago. Shocked. Frankly, I had no idea she was still living, but that was part of the surprise, but did not know she was living there either. But we publish obituaries. We establish scholarships and endowments and trust funds and build monuments. We put plaques on things in memory of, and we erect headstones in cemeteries because we want to be remembered, or we want someone we love to be remembered. And that's not a bad thing in itself. But notice how many times Nehemiah's prayer is, remember me, oh my God. We might make the case that if we put half as much effort into being remembered by God as we do to being remembered by among men, we'd be far ahead of where we are. And that's a good thought to conclude with at this point. Comments or observations? Sister Rosalind, you have anything? Roger?
When you were talking about, just the purging and the cleansing that Nehemiah did, and, just trying to, cleanse sin, I started thinking about, the church, and the fact that we don't really exercise church discipline in a consistent way like we should. And so therefore, what we do is we overlook, just like, the Corinthians did in 1 Corinthians 5, we just kind of overlook and brush it over, and it just continues and it gets worse and worse. And then on the other hand, if you have someone, a Christian, that calls it out, then you're looked upon as a troublemaker, and you're in a minority. And it's just kind of, and it just, people don't realize how it weakens the church.
Well, sin is like acid. It corrodes. It corrodes what it touches. Mm-hmm. And I will say, I'll make this observation about congregational discipline. I believe you're right in that we don't discipline consistently. Part of that, I think, is because the modern perception of the word discipline is punishment. And that's not what discipline means. Discipline means guidance. It means to disciple. It means to cause someone to walk in the footsteps of the teacher. And what happens too many times is that discipling process, which is an everyday, day in, day out, week in, week out, ongoing process, gets neglected to the point that someone then begins to behave or act in such a way that their actions can't be overlooked. And then we overreact with what we describe as church discipline, meaning you straight going to withdraw from you. Mm-hmm. And what we've done is we've neglected everything that should have been taking place all along.
Right.
From ever getting to that point.
Yep.
And in that context, having to come to the point of withdrawing fellowship ought to be a relatively rare thing compared to everything else that ought to precede it. And that's my 2 cents worth, and that and $1.50 will get you a cup of coffee anywhere in town. Anyway, but your point is well taken about discipline in that respect. A lot of times the one who points out the need for it is the one who's vilified. Well, let's take about 15 minutes and we'll come back and take a look at Esther, unless there are other comments or questions. Let's talk about Esther. This book, this story, is part of what's called the Megillah in Hebrew, the 5 scrolls that are traditionally read at the feasts of the Hebrews. Now, it's interesting that the traditional reading for Passover is the Song of Songs, Song of Solomon. At Pentecost, traditionally they read the book of Ruth. Ecclesiastes goes with the Feast of Tabernacles. And Lamentations is read for a ceremony on the anniversary of the destruction of the temple. Esther, and when you think about it, you can see why. Esther is what's read at Purim, which of course has its roots in Esther. And that Feast of Purim originates during the time of Esther, and it is still observed. And it comes from the Persian word. It's not a Hebrew word, actually. It comes from the Persian word puru, which means lot, like to cast a lot. Traditionally, when Esther is read in that setting at Purim, the reader reads and the congregation responds with, groans of disapproval or should we say cheers, as it were, of approval at the high points and the low points, at the evil characters and the good characters and so forth. It's an interactive experience of sorts in most Jewish congregations, most synagogues. This is traditionally grouped in the Hebrew Bible with the other wisdom literature. Our English Bible puts it out of order, but after Ezra and Nehemiah, because it belongs to the same period. It by rights, Esther belongs in the middle of the book of Ezra chronologically. And of course, the title is for the primary character. Esther comes from a Persian word that means star. It would have the same etymological roots in a sense as Stella in Latin. The Hebrew name is Hadassah, which means myrtle. And Hadassah is still a common name for Jewish girls. In fact, former Senator Joe Lieberman's wife is named Hadassah. And is probably the best known woman with that name in this country. And that is a popular, even now, a popular name among Jews for a girl, understandably so. She is, on many levels, she is a heroine to Jewish people, even though, who was she married to? She's married to a Gentile king, married in a setting that would fall far outside the boundaries of the norm or what would be hoped for or expected by a typical Hebrew family. The book of Esther deals with, in a sense, deals with what happened to the Jews who passed up the opportunity to go with Zerubbabel back to the promised land. 586, Cyrus issues the decree, you can go home. I'll underwrite it. I'm sending funds to rebuild the temple. You offer sacrifices for me. Of course, Cyrus does not live to see the temple completed or to know that it's completed. It's going to take 20 years to get it done. But as we've talked about, most Jews did not return. And that's understandable on a variety of different levels. Economic. Why would you give up a comfortable life in Babylon or Shushan or some surrounding suburb for hardship and privation in an area where all the neighbors hate you and don't want you there and will try to prevent you from prospering? It's much easier to write a check, as it were, for, cousin whatever his name is, to go in your place, as it were. These events take place in the reign of King Ahasuerus, who is almost not mentioned elsewhere in the scriptures. He takes his reign lasts from about 486 to about 465 BC. So he's after Cyrus and Darius and before Artaxerxes of Nehemiah's time, Ezra's time. It's between chapter 6 and chapter 7 in the book of Ezra. And what happens here occurs entirely in Gentile territory, entirely over in Persia, modern day Iraq. Not far from places that a lot of our troops saw up close and personal in the Iraqi war. When Cyrus permitted the Jews to go home, most did not. And what we see in Esther is that God took care of those who did not, just like he took care of those who did. We look through Ezra and Nehemiah, and where's the focus? The focus is in Jerusalem and Judah. All the troubles, tribulations, opposition, problems, trials, hardships they experienced, God took care of them. Every time they tried to do right, God took care of them. Every time they didn't, God let them have the consequences of their foolish choices. Esther shows us God took care of his people outside as well. And
his name is not mentioned.
Exactly. God, that's the standout peculiarity, you might say, of the book of Esther. God is never mentioned. And it's partly for that reason that Talmudic scholars debated whether or not Esther belongs in the canon of Scripture. In the days of the intertestamental period, when they were translating from Hebrew into Greek over a period of 150, 200 years, producing what would become the Septuagint, there was hot debate among some of the Jewish scholars. Does this book belong in the scriptures or not? Because God is not mentioned at all. And yet you read through it, he's present almost every line in the book. And he's present with his people who did not return in the flesh, just like he's present with those who did. Herodotus, who is a non-biblical ancient Greek writer, Herodotus gives us some additional information about King Ahasuerus and his reign. He's better known in archaeological history as Xerxes or Xerxes the First. So when you read about Xerxes in the encyclopedia, you're reading about Ahasuerus. There is a gap in chapter 1 between verse 3 and verse 7. Well, between his third year and his 7th year, a gap between chapter 1, verse 3 and chapter 2, the dating there. The Bible doesn't say anything about what he was doing during that time. Herodotus tells us all about it. And what he was doing was trying to invade Greece. And it was an unqualified disaster for the Persians. This is the time frame of the battles on the plains of Marathon and with the Spartans and so forth. If you've seen some of the movies, the 300 and so forth, these are the events of that time frame. And so this is a period of tremendous world-shaking events. But those things are not germane to the story of Judah, and so they're not mentioned here. If you look at chapter 1, in verses 1 through 9, this feast corresponds to that third year. And we talked a little bit about that several weeks ago. It seems astounding to us, but the normal practice of the Persians, when they contemplated some world-shaking move like this, was to gather all the nobles and basically get them as drunk as they could get and keep them that way and propose, what shall we do, while they're drunk. And someone would record all of this, and then when they'd sobered up, they'd go back and review it, and anything that made sense, okay, then the gods must smile on that, and everything else that didn't make sense, they'd throw out. That's how he winds up undertaking this expedition against Greece. It was not a good choice. They got thoroughly whipped. Now, Ahasuerus becomes king in 486. In 483, his queen Vashti is deposed because this is the time frame of that conference that Herodotus mentions to undertake this expedition. 3 years later, 480, the expedition takes place, and Ahasuerus and the Persians are soundly defeated at Salamis, and his fleet is destroyed as well. And so 4 years after that, now, or in the 7th year of his reign, 4 years after he starts, is when Esther marries him, when she is added to his harem and becomes his primary wife, his queen. Haman's plot takes place about 5 years after that, about 475. So we're getting down to the time toward the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, but we're not there yet. We're about halfway through that period between the completion of the temple and Ezra and Nehemiah. Who wrote Esther? Who recorded it? Don't know. No name is given. Tradition says that it was Mordecai. Whether it was or not, we don't know. It would seem that the writer would be a very patriotic Jew, and one in Persia, not in Judah. Baba Batra, another historical document of that period, suggests that the men of the great synagogue recorded the story of Esther, not Mordecai. Josephus, though, says it was Mordecai. Who do we believe? Holy Spirit is the author. It does seem clear whoever it was that wrote it down was an eyewitness to all of these things. We talked a little bit about Purim a minute ago, and this book gives us the historical background of Purim. We come into the 1st century and we find the Jews celebrating Passover, Pentecost, Feast of the Tabernacles, Feast of the Dedication, Feast of Purim. No mention of the Feast of the Dedication or the Feast of Purim in the high holy days set out in the book of Leviticus. They weren't part of the original things, and they were not enjoined by God. But they were feasts that were added, they were celebrations added by the Jews. Purim, in the circumstances of Esther, and the Feast of the Dedication by the Maccabees about 300 years later. This gives us the background of Purim, the cast of characters. You've got Ahasuerus, the Persian king. You've got Vashti, the queen at the time that the story begins. You've got Esther, who's going to end up taking her place. Mordecai, her uncle / cousin, the relationship is not 100% clear to us. But then there's Haman. And Haman occupies in Persia basically the position that Joseph did in Egypt to a large degree. He doesn't start out that way, but he ends up there, Grand Vizier or Prime Minister, basically, of Persia. High ranking enough that he has the king's signet ring. He can issue commands in the name of the king. And he is a thoroughly wicked man. There is some irony in the choosing of the name Purim for this holiday. We said it means lot, as in to cast lots. And that goes back not to Esther, but to Haman. Because how does, according to Esther chapter 3, how does Haman select the day that he's going to execute all the Jews? By casting lots. So there is an ironic to the description of this celebration in that way. In chapter 3 and verse 7, the best time for his evil deed is the 13th day of the month of Adar. And it's only through Esther's intervention that all of this is prevented. Look at chapter 9, verses 20 through 22. The 14th and 15th days of that month now become the feast of Purim. It's not described that way here, but you look at verses 20 through 22. Mordecai recorded all these things, sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month of Adar and also the 15th day of the same, year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies. So that's the root of the celebration. Now, when is Adar? That corresponds to February and March in our calendar. And 21st century, here we are 2,500 years later, and observant Jews still observe Purim. If you want to summarize Esther in a single word, what's the word? What word would you choose?
You mean to summarize the book or?
The whole story.
Providence, maybe?
There you go.
God's providence.
The whole book of Esther demonstrates God's providence in action. And it also demonstrates that providence is not miraculous. There's a difference between miracles and providence. Nothing miraculous takes place in the book of Esther, does it? But God's presence and God's caring for his people and God's arranging circumstances for the benefit of, to preserve his people, to preserve our Savior's lineage, is present throughout the whole record. Providence in action to preserve the messianic lineage. So it's not luck. It's not coincidence that Esther is in the right place at the right time. Now you look at chapter 4 as the plot of Haman is coming to the fore and coming to its fruition, it seems. And what's Mordecai's statement to Esther in about verse 14? Who knows? But for such a time as this, you've come into the kingdom. Mordecai is not saying it's providential that you're here. You have to do this. But he's saying it could be. How do you recognize providence? How can you identify providence?
Sometimes you can do it only by looking backwards.
Only in the rearview mirror. In the moment, you don't know. You might suspect. You might even be strongly persuaded this or that is providential. But you don't know until you look back. How do you identify providence? How do you isolate it and identify it? You can't? Let's qualify that. I would agree. You can't absolutely, concretely prove this or that is the providence of God. However, when you look at a circumstance, a situation, an incident in the rearview mirror, and you examine and for whatever reasons discard every other reasonable, logical explanation for why things happened the way they did, the only thing left is the providence of God. When every other reasonable explanation, every other natural explanation is disqualified or exhausted, the only thing left is the providence of God. And that's important because we don't see that in the moment usually. Why did this person come into my life in this moment? Why did this event take place at this time? Why was I here and not there? Why was I prepared for this or educated for that? Until we see it in hindsight and can evaluate all the other circumstances, we can't put it down to providence. But once we have, we can see the hand of God in it.
And I made the statement before talking about Esther, specifically chapter 4. God's going to accomplish what he wants.
Yeah.
And it's up to us to prepare ourselves and be available to help as much as we can.
God's will is going to be done. The only question is, am I going to be part of it or not? That's in that sense, in that context, that the answer to that question is really no different than the answer that I can make when God offers me a covenant. Do you want to be saved? Here are the terms. Yes or no. That's what I get to say. Yes or no. Am I available or am I not? That's my choice when God calls. Now you pick up in chapter 1, and the background of this is the meeting, the setting that we were talking about a minute ago. And in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. Now, why does he name him that way? Well, he's not the only Ahasuerus in history, but he's the one who reigned this huge territory from India. That's from Hindu territory, from the Indus River, basically, all the way south through Egypt into East Africa, the land of Cush. That's all of the Fertile Crescent and a whole lot more. At that time, this is the largest geographic empire in history. It encompasses more than Babylon. Alexander will add to it. The Romans will ultimately rule a lot more than this territory. But it's the biggest empire of its time up to that point. 127 provinces. Now you flip over to Daniel chapter 6 and verse 1. And in Daniel's day, Nebuchadnezzar ruled 120 provinces. So this is bigger than Daniel's and Nebuchadnezzar's territory. More to it. Now, Herodotus, that historian, tells us there were 20 taxing districts in Ahasuerus Empire. But there's not a direct correlation between the taxing district and the province, so we don't have a conflict here. You have one entity that Herodotus records, which has to do with civil administration or financial administration, and you've got this that the Holy Spirit records that has to do with the volume of territory that the king rules. And this is a staggering empire. This is all of the ancient world, basically. What's going on in the rest of the world at this time? There are people in the rest of the world. There are cities and villages and civilizations elsewhere in the world. Humanity is spreading throughout the rest of the world, but the Celts and the Picts and the Franks and the Goths in Europe are still living in stick huts and wearing hides and fighting with rocks and stones and clubs. The people in Asia are not appreciably better. The only real civilization that we would recognize is in this empire for the most part. Everything else pales by comparison. So in the third, he's in Shushan or Susa. That's the Persian capital. Ecbatana is the Median capital. Babylon is the other of the three capital cities. Shushan is the primary capital at this point. Persians are in charge. And so that's where he's located. The feast. Gives a feast for all of his servants and all of his powers. These would be the army commanders, the high-ranking officials, the chief of staff, the general staff of the army, basically. All the nobles and the governors of the provinces that were before him. So he's gathered together all of his, I don't know if we'd call it a brain trust, considering how they go about presenting their ideas, but he's gathered all of his consultation team together. The leaders are all there. And at verse 4, he puts on the dog. A tremendous PR job here. You look at verse 4, he shows the riches of his royal glory, the splendor and the pomp and the greatness for 180 days. Well, this is not a 6-month-long conference. This is the time frame where all of this is going on. There's travel time involved, different delegations arriving different places and so forth. It's this time frame that is set that leads up to the conference, the meeting. So you've got a 6 months feast. As these people are coming in, they're being feted, they're being toured around, they're being shown the splendor of Shushan. Some of these people have probably never seen Shushan before and never will again. But they have been servants and representatives and governors under the king. How many times, going back to the book of Nehemiah for a minute, how many times had Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem ever seen Shushan, ever seen Artaxerxes face to face? May have been only the time that they actually went there to consult against Nehemiah. Being in the king's presence was not a normal situation for most of these people. Serving him was, but actually seeing him face to face would not have been a normal thing for them. Now, at the end of the time, everybody's there. You've got 6 months to get here. Well, for somebody coming from Ethiopia, it's going to take 6 months just to get there. Somebody coming from India, it's depending on how far into India they are, it may be equal there. They've got some serious territory to cross. So at the end of the 6 months, now we're going to gather all this together. The king gave for all the people present, both great and small, a feast lasting 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. White cotton curtains, violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods, marble pillars, couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones, drinks served in golden vessels of different kinds, royal wine lavished according to the bounty of the king. So no expense is spared. No limit to what they're going to use here. And notice verse 8, drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. The king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. That idea, no compulsion, no limits, no boundaries. Nobody's forced, but there's no limit. The queen entertains the wives, verse 9. Even the wives are feted and entertained, which is they have no role in this other than as consorts to their husbands. But for the king to provide for them, even through his queen, is an indicator of just how tremendous his largesse is, how impressive this is that even the wives are brought in as well. And so you get to the end of the 7 days feasting, seventh day, the heart of the king is merry with wine, and so he sends for the queen. She's entertaining the women. The name Vashti means beautiful woman, and it may be a description rather than a proper name. Herodotus gives her another name in his record, but you've got 7 eunuchs here: Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass. These are the king's right-hand men. These men would actually occupy roles in the presence of the king, not too different from what Nehemiah did for Artaxerxes, in the sense that they're right there with him all the time. So they're sent to summon her, to show her beauty, to display herself. Now, 3 possibilities here. In verse 11, bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she's lovely to look at. And she refused to come, and the king became enraged. To show her beauty, there are 3 schools of thought going back to this imagery here. One would be, you come unveiled. Your face is not covered, fully clothed, but without your veil. And that would be understood as an insult to her. In other words, you are my property. You do what I say, regardless of the embarrassment to you. There are some scholars and commentators who read this and say, no, this was a command that she appear utterly unclothed except for the crown. Come buck naked. I want to show off your natural beauty. Historically, you go back to Herodotus and others writing of the time, have been either one with this particular king. There's no way to pin down definitively which possibility is the case. Kings are not known for their self-restraint or their shyness about embarrassing people. So it certainly could have been either one. Regardless, she is his primary wife. She is the queen. It's pretty well a given that he had a whole harem in addition to her, but she's the queen, and she is not going to sacrifice her dignity as queen and her dignity as his wife in front of a bunch of drunken men, even if they're not all thoroughly inebriated. Certainly her husband is. It's worth pointing out he controls his anger. Verse 12, he became enraged, his anger burned within him. And it doesn't seem that he reacted in this moment. He didn't immediately throw her out or banish her or anything of the sort. He consulted. Solomon says, in the multitude of counselors, there's safety. In the multitude of drunken counselors, that's not necessarily the case. He is going to do something that he will regret on the basis of their counsel. Now, you look at verses 13 through 15. The king said to the wise men who knew the times, this was his procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment, the men next to him being Karshena, Shether, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom. According to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs. What does the law say about this? Now, these men are described as men who understood the times, the King James Version, wise men, men who were versed in the law and judgment, the English Standard Version says. These would have been his astrologers and his magi, his wise men. Same terminology that's used to describe those who came from the east at the birth of Jesus, though those were, in my judgment, almost certainly Jewish scholars, not Gentiles like these. These are the ruling princes. These would represent the ruling families, the houses of the Medes and the Persians amongst all of those of the empire. So these are the top dogs in the empire. What does the law say? Why would the king ask about the law? We think about kings, rulers of that sort, and what do we typically picture? Yeah, they're a law to themselves. They why do I need to ask about the law? I am the law, that sort of thing. And that's not the kind of king that this man is. That's not the image that fits among the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Medo-Persians. Remember, the Medo-Persian Empire is a coalition empire. It's a coalition of the Medes on one side and the Persians on the other, and they govern, their ruling families govern together in part by alternating generation to generation between a Median king and a Persian king. It's not simply line of birth in their arrangement. They have rules. They have laws. The Babylonians did too. The Assyrians before them. There were laws in Egypt as well, though there was enough upheaval in Egypt that the pharaohs were, and of course the pharaohs perpetuated the idea that they were divinity anyhow. But our image of the king as being just the absolute unrestrained dictator doesn't fit what ancient history actually presents in this case.
We see in Daniel, the king could not, once he made the law,
Yeah.
he could not change the law.
You're right. Daniel
No,
illustrates that the laws of the Babylonians couldn't be easily changed, and we'll get to that same thing here in Esther with the laws of the Medes and the Persians. Once it's written and sealed, it's a deal. You'll notice, and we'll come back to this as we move forward, but concerning Haman's scheme to destroy all the Jews, Haman lays all the plans and he gives all the orders and he seals the orders with the king's ring. And so when Haman is exposed and then executed, that law, which has the force of the king's signature because it's got his seal on it, that law is still in force. That order is still in place and it can't be undone. So how do they get around it? Well, their legal system worked a little bit like the modern Texas Constitution, which has 100 and however many, 127, 137 amendments to it. They had to pass another law in order to deal with that law. Think about the, what is it, the 18th Amendment that outlawed alcohol in the United States in 1919, and then they had to pass the 21st Amendment, I think, in 1933 that repeals the 18th Amendment in order to legalize beverage alcohol once again. That's the setup that you've got in the Medo-Persian Empire. They actually had to pass another law to nullify this law. And it didn't actually nullify the law, it simply attenuated it. It allowed the Jews to defend themselves. So you've got this this scenario. What does the law say? And really the question is, what can be done legally about this? She has the crown of the queen. How do we deal with this? And so you start to read the council here and look at the focus. Look where the counselors' focus is. Not only against the king has Vashti done wrong, but against all the officials and the peoples who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. Her example will spread. Wow, we can't let this happen. Who's present in Shushan? You've got all the princes and the nobles and the high-ranking military officials and who's over in the women's wing of the palace? All their wives. Shakespeare, in The Taming of the Shrew, depicts a scene very much like this, where now I can't remember the characters' names. Catherine is the wife, and I can't remember the husband's name, but the husband at a banquet proposes a wager with a couple of his friends, and this one sends for his wife and she refuses him, and this one sends for his wife and she refuses him. And so the lead character commands his wife, the shrew, Catherine, who then, having figured out that if she'll work with him, he'll treat her like a queen, not only responds and comes willingly, but drags the other two wives with her and lectures them about being a good wife. These guys are afraid that Vashti will set a bad example for their wives, who are probably present in that moment. Notice what it says in verse 18. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all of the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. It helps for us to keep in mind what the perspective of the ancient world was on the relationship between a husband and a wife. In most ancient cultures, including this one, women did not own property. Women did not have rights except as their husbands defined them. In this culture, like most other ancient cultures, they were basically property. And it was as unthinkable to these men that a wife should defy what they wanted as that a horse or a donkey should not respond to its reins, to its bridle. They were property and nothing more in their judgment. Very pretty pleasant property, but property nonetheless. There was, in a lot of ways, very little difference between being a wife in this setting and being a slave. And so these men are very, very focused on maintaining their position and their rights and so forth. They're not going to put up with this from their wives. So let an order go out from the king. And notice what it says, and let it be written among the laws of the Medes and the Persians, so that it may never be repealed, that Vashti is never to come again before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. Now, the king could give commands, just speak and it better be done. But if it's written down, it's irreversible. It cannot be revoked. And these guys are, there's more than a little bit of self-interest in their response. You really, reading through Esther, you get a fascinating and vivid image of the dynamics of human relationships and human motives from practically every person mentioned here. These guys are very focused on taking care of themselves. They are a very self-centered, I won't say self-absorbed, but very self-centered society. The men of that era. Give her position, her royal position, to another. Put her in her place. Strip her of her privileges, her benefits. Is she cast out of the harem? I don't know. Doesn't say so. But writing the law down also ensures that Ahasuerus is not going to get weeks or months or even years down the road and regret that he has done this and say, well, I'll bring her back. She suffered enough or whatnot. No, if it's written down, there's no retrieving her for him. So there's an element of deviousness in these guys' reply, which you pause and think about it. If they are this selfish, self-centered, and this devious about how they go about things, just with something that on the grand scale of things really is pretty minor. Imagine what the intrigue and the backbiting and deal making and backstabbing and so forth must have been like among them behind the king's back. You want to talk about jockeying for position. They make James and John asking to sit at the right and left hand of Jesus. They make them look like pikers in that respect. So the motive is plain. You look down to verse 20, when the decree is to be made, it puts not just the queen, but every other woman in the kingdom. Put them in their place. And that's the attitude that's presented here. When the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all the kingdom, it's vast. All women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. We'll scare the life out of them, and they won't dare argue with us or say a cross word to us. That's the motivation here. And you look at verses 21 and 22. He likes that idea in this moment. Decisions made in anger are almost never good decisions, are they? You go back to
Decisions made under the influence of alcohol.
well, there's that too. There's that too. But you go back to verse 12, he's enraged. He's just seething inside. If he were not intoxicated, number one, if he were not intoxicated, he might not have demanded such an outlandish thing in the first place. Number two, if he were not intoxicated, even if he had said something that stupid, he might quickly have thought better of it. But number three, decisions taken in anger are seldom ever beneficial decisions. And so the advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king followed Memucan's proposal and sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. So he did exactly what Memucan recommended. He did exactly what these egotistical, self-centered, conniving, backstabbing politicians wanted. And when has a politician ever had a good idea? Not to paint with too broad a brush, but in the multitude of counselors, there's safety. In the multitude of drunken, self-centered counselors, there's just stupidity. And that's exactly what you see here. That's a good place to stop for next time. And so we'll look into chapter 2 and move on from there with the majority of the story, as it were, at that point. Other questions, other thoughts? If not, then good night.
Good night.
Good night, Miss Rosalind. You have a good evening.